The train screeched to a halt somewhere in the heart of Texas. Inside the wooden boxcars, hundreds of German soldiers pressed against the slats, staring through gaps at a world that made no sense. It was summer, 1944. The war in Europe was collapsing, and for these men, former Wehrmacht soldiers captured in North Africa, Italy and France, the nightmare had changed shape. No more shells, no more blood. Just an endless horizon of golden fields, barbed wire, and a sun too bright to be real. When the doors opened, the heat hit them like a furnace. They stumbled out, some blinking into the light, others shielding their eyes. Around them stood men in khaki uniforms, rifles slung casually across their shoulders. Americans, young and relaxed. Not like the hard-faced soldiers they had fought in Tunisia or Normandy, but what struck them most wasn't the guards. It was the sound, the distant clatter of farm machinery, the smell of wheat and oil, and the faint music drifting from a farmhouse radio. A country song. "Welcome to America," one guard said, smiling as he handed a canteen to a German prisoner too weak to stand. The man blinked, confused. He had been told Americans hated them, that they were brutes, that capture meant humiliation. But this was not humiliation. This was strange. They were loaded onto trucks, open flatbeds that rumbled across miles of farmland. To their left, endless rows of corn shimmered under the afternoon sun. To their right, white houses with red barns stood like something from a painting. Children waved as the trucks passed. Some even shouted in German. One POW, a 22-year-old from Hamburg named Karl, leaned forward, confused. "Did I hear that right?" he asked. The man next to him nodded slowly. "They're speaking German, but with an accent. No one could believe it." When they finally reached the camp, a cluster of wooden barracks surrounded by barbed wire, a local farmer stood waiting at the gate with the American sergeant. He was tall, sunburned, and smiling beneath a wide-brimmed hat. He looked the prisoners up and down and said in slow but clear German, "We'll comin' in Texas, youngs. Welcome to Texas, boys." The prisoners froze. He spoke their language perfectly, a strange kind of freedom. The German POW camps in America were unlike anything most of them expected. Here, far from the front, there was no hatred, no shouting. The guards were polite. The food was good, sometimes too good. Under the Geneva Convention, America treated POWs according to strict international rules. They received rations, cigarettes, mail, even pay for their labor. But the true shock came when the work details began. Each morning, groups of prisoners were trucked out beyond the wire to work on nearby farms. They harvested cotton, picked fruit, fixed fences, drove tractors. For most of them, who had been soldiers since youth, it was the first honest labor they had done in years, and then came the moment that changed everything. Karl, the young prisoner from Hamburg, was assigned to the Müller farm, a name that sounded familiar even before he saw the mailbox. When they arrived, the farmer greeted them in German. Not perfect, but fluent enough. "Guten Morgen, boys," he said. "Ich bin Heinrich Müller. My grandparents came from Bremen." Karl stared at him, stunned. The farmer's name was Müller. His grandparents were German. And yet here he was, an American. All around, the same story repeated itself. Farmers named Schmidt, Bauer, Weber, or Schneider came out to greet their POW workers, many with accents that sounded like home. They offered water, shade, and food. Sometimes they laughed about old family names or the towns their ancestors came from. The Germans had been told America was a nation of enemies, foreign, alien, decadent. Instead, they found echoes of themselves everywhere. They were surrounded by people who looked like them, spoke like them, cooked like them, and that realization was unsettling, the shock of similarity. By autumn, the heat had faded into long, quiet days. The prisoners had fallen into a rhythm: work, meals, letters, sleep. For most, captivity no longer felt like punishment. It felt like waiting, like living in a strange dream that wasn't entirely unpleasant. Karl spent his days on the Müller farm, harvesting cotton beneath the pale Texas sky. Every morning, Mrs. Müller would bring out a metal pitcher of lemonade, setting it on the porch rail. She always smiled, and though she spoke English, Karl could hear the rhythm of the old German language in her words. Sometimes she'd hum songs he recognized. Lili Marleen, Heimat, Deine Sterne, old German tunes that echoed through the rows of cotton-like ghosts from another life. It was disorienting. In the distance, the stars and stripes fluttered on the farmhouse roof, but everything else, the faces, the names, the songs, felt unmistakably German. That evening, back in the barracks, Karl and the others talked quietly. "How many of them are like that?" asked Ernst, a former artilleryman from Leipzig. "Half," Karl said. "Maybe more. The Müllers, the Webers, the Schmidts, they all came from Germany once. Some still speak our language better than their English." Ernst frowned, poking at his food. "Then why are we enemies?" No one answered. The question hung in the stale air of the wooden barrack, like smoke from a dying fire. The next day, Karl rode with Heinrich Müller to deliver feed to a neighboring farm. The man was in his 50s, with calloused hands and a quiet dignity, the kind of man Karl's father had been before the war. As the truck rumbled down a dusty road, Müller asked him, "Where are you from, son?" "Hamburg," Karl replied. Müller nodded. "My people came from Bremen." "Not far." They drove in silence for a while until Müller said, almost to himself, "Funny thing, isn't it? My grandfather left Germany to find freedom. Yours stayed and lost it." Karl looked down, unsure how to respond. Müller went on, his voice steady. "I still have family there. Cousins, maybe. Haven't heard from them since '39. I pray they're alive." Karl hesitated, then said softly, "My city was bombed last winter. Entire streets gone. If your cousins lived near the docks, maybe they didn't make it." Müller nodded slowly, eyes on the road. "War doesn't care which side you're on. It just eats everything." Back at the farm, Karl couldn't shake those words. War eats everything. He began noticing the little things, how the Müllers said grace before meals, the same way his parents once had, how the children called their grandfather Opa, how even the bread smelled the same as home. But it wasn't home. It was what home could have been if the world had made different choices. Sometimes on Sundays, the prisoners were allowed to attend church services, always guarded, always supervised. Yet even there, sitting in wooden pews beside American farmers, Karl would hear familiar hymns sung in English with German melody lines. It was uncanny. The same faith, the same culture, only wearing different clothes. Afterward, when they walked back to the trucks, the pastor would shake their hands. "God bless you, boys," he'd say. Karl never knew how to reply. That night in the camp, the men whispered stories. One prisoner had worked for a man named Schmidt, who showed him family photos, a grandmother in a dirndl, a family farm near Stuttgart. Another had met a farmer who spoke fluent Bavarian dialect because his parents had never learned English. They realized that some of these Americans had relatives still fighting or dying out in Germany. The contradictions were dizzying. One man said, "I think I work today for a man whose cousin might be in the Wehrmacht." Another laughed bitterly. "Maybe his cousin shot at us last year in Italy." No one could tell where one world ended and the other began. And then came a day none of them forgot. Red Cross truck arrived at the camp with new mail deliveries. Among the letters was one for Karl, a thin envelope with handwriting he recognized instantly. His mother. He tore it open, eyes racing across the words. She was alive. The house was damaged, but she and his sister were safe. She wrote that the neighbors, the old Schmidt family, had fled to the countryside. And then one line made him stop. "They say your cousin Hans is working on an American farm now. Can that be true?" Karl blinked. He realized she didn't mean it literally. She meant American-style farm, perhaps run by occupation forces. But he couldn't shake the thought. What if somewhere one of their own family names, Schmidt, Weber, Müller, was on a mailbox here too? What if the world was smaller than he ever imagined? Over the following weeks, as the harvest season deepened, the line between prisoner and worker blurred further. Some farmers brought the POWs coffee in the mornings. Others let them eat lunch on the porch. One even invited them to a Thanksgiving dinner, supervised, of course, but still astonishing. And through it all, The Germans whispered the same thing to each other at night. They are like us, not better, not worse, just the same. That realization shook them more than defeat ever could. The bonds that shouldn't exist. By winter, the war in Europe had turned against Germany. News trickled into the camp through newspapers, radio chatter, and the whispers of guards. The Allies had crossed the Rhine. Berlin was burning. For many of the prisoners, it felt as though their old world was already gone, and they were now living in something new, suspended between defeat and discovery. Yet even as their homeland fell apart, something unexpected began to take root: friendship. The first time Karl truly laughed since his capture was at the Müller farm, 2 days before Christmas. The air was cold, the sky full of low grey clouds, and the fields were lined with stubble from the last harvest. Mrs. Müller had insisted the men come inside for lunch, just for warmth, she said. Inside the kitchen, the smell of baked bread and cinnamon filled the air. There was a tree in the corner, small but decorated with ribbons and paper stars. On the table lay plates of roasted chicken, potatoes, and pie. Karl and the other 2 POWs stood awkwardly at the door until Heinrich Müller waved them in. "Sit," he said with a grin. "You work like family. You'll eat like family." Karl hesitated. He knew the rules. Prisoners were not supposed to share meals with civilians. But when he looked at Mrs. Müller's face, kind, motherly eyes glinting with warmth, he couldn't refuse. They sat. They ate. And for an hour there were no sides, no uniforms, no war. Just people sharing a meal in a farmhouse surrounded by quiet fields. When they returned to camp that evening, Karl could still taste the food, the laughter, the warmth. He didn't tell the guards. He didn't have to. They probably knew. One of them, an older sergeant named Davis, handed him a pack of cigarettes. "From Mrs. M," he said. Karl smiled. "Tell her thank you," Davis nodded. "She already knows." Across the country, in camps from Alabama to Idaho, similar stories unfolded. American farmers, many with German ancestry, discovered they couldn't bring themselves to hate these men. And the prisoners, many of them boys, no older than 20, discovered that their supposed enemies lived like their own families back home. There were rules, of course. The War Department insisted on strict separation, guards, curfews. But small acts of humanity slipped through the cracks. Farmers left extra food by the tool shed. Children tossed baseballs over the fence and laughed when the POWs threw them back. Sometimes, after long days in the field, the men would share songs. The Germans singing Lily Marlene, the Americans answering with "You Are My Sunshine." At first, it felt like defiance. Then it just felt normal. In March 1945, as the war neared its bloody end, Karl found himself standing beside Heinrich Müller, mending a fence line that stretched along the edge of a wheat field. The horizon was glowing with sunset, gold and red bleeding together like the sky itself was on fire. Müller leaned on the post driver and said quietly, "You know, when this is all over, you'll go home." Karl nodded. "If there's still a home left." Müller looked at him, eyes tired but kind. "There's always a home. You just have to build it again." For a long moment they stood in silence, the only sound the creak of wood and the sigh of wind through the fields. Then Karl said, "When I was captured, I thought my life was over." Müller smiled faintly. "Sometimes losing everything is the only way to see what matters." Back at camp, word spread of Germany's collapse. Some men cheered quietly. Others cried. A few refused to believe it. Karl didn't know what to feel. He thought of his family, of his ruined city, of the farmers who spoke his language and treated him not as an enemy, but as a neighbor. And he realized something strange. The Americans had won not just the war, but his respect. Not through fear, not through violence, but through kindness. As spring returned, rumors began circulating that some POWs might be released soon, repatriated to Europe, or sent to rebuild bombed cities. The idea filled the camp with both relief and dread. For many, going home meant facing ruins. For others, it meant leaving behind something precious they had found here. Dignity, humanity, maybe even friendship. On his last day at the Müller farm, Carl stood by the truck, his hands still calloused from months of labor. Mrs. Miller pressed something into his hand, a small Bible, bound in leather. He opened it. Inside the cover, written in careful handwriting, were the words, "Gott segne dich. Come back someday as a guest." Carl looked up, blinking back tears. "I will," he said. That night, back in camp, the men gathered for one last talk. They spoke about the war, the future, the strange kindness they had met in captivity. Ernst said quietly, "I think they treated us better than we treated anyone." Carl nodded. "Maybe that's why they won." No one argued. When the trucks finally came to take them away, the American guards shook their hands. "Good luck, boys," one said. No hard feelings. And as they drove away through the endless Texas fields, the POWs looked out over the landscape, farms, barns, and families, and realized they had seen something their leaders never understood. You could conquer a nation with guns, but you could only conquer hate with humanity. Going home to a different Germany. The ship cut through grey water like a slow blade, carrying men who had left as soldiers and returned as something else. The American guards didn't bark orders anymore. They walked the deck with their hands in their pockets, trading cigarettes for stories. The POWs leaned on the rail and stared at the horizon that rose and fell with the swell, each man imagining a city, a street, a door that might not be there anymore. Carl kept the small Bible in his jacket, the one Mrs. Muller had given him. He turned it over in his hands when the wind grew sharp, reading the inscription again. "Come back someday as a guest." He wondered if the words were a promise or a mercy. On the third morning, the fog lifted and Europe appeared like a bruise in the distance. Old men who had not cried in years wiped their eyes with the backs of their hands. Young men who had promised themselves they would not break, broke. The coastline was not victory or defeat anymore. It was the weight of everything they had been and everything they still had to carry. Disembarkation was a line and a stamp and a question that had no answer. Where are you going? The British officers shrugged when the Germans said home. Home to what? To whom? The trucks that took them inland smelled of damp canvas and engine oil. The countryside was green in the way only a place washed by too much rain can be. Hedgerows brushing the sides of the convoy like hands on a coffin. They reached a transfer camp near the border, and there the Red Cross workers gave them soup and paper and pens. Carl sat at a long table under a tent and wrote his mother's name carefully on the envelope, the way a man writes a prayer. He told her he was alive. He told her he would find her. He told her nothing about the Texas sky or the sound of English hymns sung in a German tune. Some things belonged to silence. Trains took them east, slow and shuddering, stopping often to let longer, more important trains pass. Coal, timber, food, the heavy heartbeat of a nation trying to stand. In the stations, signs were new and crooked, letters painted over old letters. Children sold buttons and matches from boxes. Women stared past the uniform coats as if the men inside were already ghosts. Hamburg announced itself before Carl saw it. A smell of wet ash and river mud. When the train finally pulled in, the platform was crowded with people who moved like survivors of a storm. Quick, practical, without ceremony. Carl stepped down into a city that had kept its bones but lost its skin. Streets he had walked as a boy were there in name only. The stones had been rearranged into a geometry of loss. He found the block where his mother had lived by memory and luck. The house itself was gone, a rectangle of emptiness with a twisted stove in the corner like an altar. He stood in the middle of the absence and listened. Wind through broken brick makes a sound like paper being turned. He closed his eyes and heard her voice. Anyway, a neighbor found him there. An old woman with a scarf knotted under her chin, carrying water in 2 dented pails. "You are Lotta's boy," she said, as if picking up a conversation that had paused only for breath. When Carl nodded, she set the pails down and took his hand. Not the way a stranger takes a hand, but the way family does. She moved to the edge of the city. A schoolhouse made into rooms. Come. The schoolhouse was red brick with windows patched by cardboard and old newspaper. Inside, the hall smelled of soap and potatoes, and the fatigue of too many people in too small a space. Carl's mother opened a door, and the years fell off her face so fast they seemed to shatter on the floor. She touched his cheeks the way a blind person explores a face. No blessings, no speeches, just the inventory of a mother. 10 fingers, 10 toes, the familiar scar by the eyebrow, the breath that meant my child is still in the world. They cooked soup that night in a dented pot. His sister arrived from a clothing depot with a roll of fabric and a laugh that did not belong to a city like this. They ate slowly, stretching the meal the way poor people stretch holidays. When Carl took out the Bible, his mother turned it in her hands and read the inscription twice. "An American woman gave you this?" she asked, not in suspicion but in wonder. "A German-American," Carl said. She sounded like Oma. He tried to describe the fields, the porch, the way the farmer had said "willkommen," as if he had been expecting them all along. His mother listened with a face that understood more than words could hold. When he told her the farmer's name, Müller, she laughed softly. "The world is round," she said. "It keeps meeting itself." The next weeks were work. Carl registered at the local office for former soldiers and learned the new arithmetic of peace. Ration cards, queue numbers, a job board that was only a board. He joined crews that carried rubble by hand into carts and then into trucks, the city moving itself grain by grain toward the idea of a future. He learned the names of bricks by how they cut his palms. He slept with the ache that honest labor leaves. Sometimes in the afternoon, if the line at the water pump was long, he would take out the Bible and read the thin pages. Not for the sermons, but for the handwriting inside the cover. He would imagine the melody of Mrs. Muller's voice as she said, "Come back someday." And the sentence would warm him like soup. One morning, an announcement went up in the square looking for men who could drive tractors, handle tools, mend fences. A relocation program was sending skilled laborers to farms outside the city for seasonal work. The list of needed tradesmen read like a psalm of ordinary life: carpenters, mechanics, field hands. Carl stared at the paper and thought of rows of cotton under a Texas sun. He put his name down. The farm in Lower Saxony was a different country, only in the way dialects are different languages, fields instead of ruins, wind that smelled of hay instead of smoke. The farmer was widowed, with a daughter who tied her hair with a blue ribbon and led the horse with the confidence of a general. They showed Carl the tractor, a stubborn machine with a personality. He coaxed it like a mule, whispering to it, listening for the cough that meant choke and the sigh that meant fuel. At lunch on the first day, they sat on the low wall and ate bread that broke clean and cheese that remembered grass. The farmer asked where he had been captured, the way one asks where a storm had found a ship. When Carl told him about Texas, the man's eyes sharpened with a kind of longing. "My brother went to Wisconsin in 1927, he said. Sends Christmas cards with cows on them. We have not seen him since before the war." He paused, then added, almost shy, "He signed his last letter, Weber." The name detonated in Carl's chest like a small, bright explosion. He told the farmer about the names he had seen on mailboxes, the English children shouting German words, the Sunday hymns that wore American vowels over German bones. The farmer listened the way hungry men listen to recitations of feasts. When Carl finished, the man said, "If the world is going to be mended, it will be mended there first, in the places that already belong to two countries." In the evenings, after the day's chores were finished, the farmer's daughter set a radio on the kitchen windowsill. The announcer's voice came and went with the weather, but the music traveled clearly enough. Songs about new roads and the pride of small towns. Carl thought of the country station that had drifted out of the Müller farmhouse and smiled at the symmetry. 2 kitchens, 2 continents, the same insistence on ordinary joy. A letter arrived from the Red Cross with an American stamp and a tidy hand. Mrs. Müller had written through the tracing service, "The way lost messages find their owners if you give them enough patient clerks. We pray you are safe. We think of you when we harvest. Heinrich says the West Field needed your hands this year. If you can write, write. If you can visit, visit. The guest room has clean sheets and a window that looks at the dawn. Enclosed was a small photograph. Two children on the porch steps, wider now, the girl with braids, the boy holding a wooden airplane. Carl held the picture for a long time before he passed it around the table. The farmer's daughter pointed at the toy plane and grinned. "He flies better than my horse." His mother cried quietly when she saw the American postmark. Not from sorrow, but from the strange relief that comes when the future becomes imaginable again. Spring turned the world green, like a mercy. Jobs grew where there had been only lists. A cooperative opened a workshop for engines that had been left to rust in hedges. Carl signed on and made them breathe again, one by one. He learned the sound of a seized piston, the way a doctor learns the sound of a fever. Men brought him wrecks and left with machines. He did not cheat on his prices. People remembered. On Sundays, he took a tram to the river and walked along the water with his mother. Barges went by with names painted on their sides that were as old as lullabies. Hoffnung, Geduld, Morgenstern. Hope, Patience, Morning Star. He told her stories of Texas in small cups. She drank each one like medicine. "You should go," she said one afternoon, surprising them both. "Not to leave, to return. A person should thank those who saved his life." Saved. The word sat heavily and then kindly. He wrote a letter to the Texas address on the back of the photograph. His German careful, his English honest and awkward. He wrote about the fence line, about the Thanksgiving meal he had eaten as a prisoner, about the cigarette pack from Sergeant Davis with "From Mrs. M" written on the paper. He wrote about the schoolhouse that smelled of potatoes and soap. He did not write about the nights he woke from dreams, hearing children shout "Danke" in American voices. The reply came fast for a letter that had to cross an ocean. "Carl," we shouted when your letter arrived. "We are all well. The fields are too big for two hands. If you come, you will work. If you do not come, you will still be ours. Bring your Bible. It needs dust." It was signed by all of them, even the boy with the airplane, who printed his name so hard the ink bled through. He did not go that year. The workshop needed him, and his mother had a cough that sounded like a boot on gravel. He saved money in a jar and then in a bank. He learned to sleep without dreaming of searchlights. He learned to laugh without permission. By the time he stood again in a harbor looking west, the world had found a new rhythm. A German passport lay in his pocket, with a visa stamped cleanly. No suspicion in the ink, only the bureaucratic faith that stamps confer. On the ship, the linen was stiff and the coffee was strong and bitter. When he reached New York, the sky was taller than he had imagined, and the buildings leaned together like conspirators. He took a train until the fields began, and then a bus, until the road became a lane, and then a truck that dropped him at a mailbox with a name that had never stopped being his. The porch steps were wider and the paint was newer, and the faces were the same. Heinrich Müller had more lines around his eyes and a wider grin. Mrs. Müller's hair had gone white, the way fireworks go white at their brightest. The girl with braids was a young woman now, and the boy had a real airplane, the kind that laughs at gravity. They hugged him the way families hug. Once hard, then again because the first time could not possibly be enough. They fed him until he laughed, and then they fed him again because laughter is a hunger too. They took him to the west field and showed him the fence line he had mended, and the big oak that threw the same shade. He slept in the room with the dawn window and woke to a light that looked like water poured slowly over the floor. On Sunday, they drove him to the church, where the hymns were the same shape as the ones in Hamburg, even when the words changed their coats. After the service, the pastor shook his hand and said, "We prayed for enemies during the war. We prayed they would eat and sleep and go home. We prayed they would come back different. Looks like God knows his business." In the afternoon, they sat on the porch and passed the photograph back and forth, the old one with the wooden airplane and the new one with a real one. Carl told them about the rebuilt streets, the workshop, his mother's cough, the way barges carried the word hope up the river like it was cargo. Heinrich told him about the drought that didn't last, The prices that fell and then rose, the neighbor who died and left a field that no one wanted because it was too far from water. "It grows good cotton anyway," he said. "Sometimes things don't know they are impossible." They took him to neighboring farms where Schmidts and Webers and Bowses kept mailboxes that embarrassed the telephone directory. He shook hands with men whose grandfathers had left for reasons that rhymed with his own: hunger, pride, the idea of a future. They spoke English that leaned toward German, and German that had learned some English mannerisms. In every kitchen, he heard Oma and Opa and Grace said over food that had crossed oceans inside seeds. He worked that summer not as a prisoner, but as a guest who paid for his keep with sweat. He repaired engines with a language that has only nouns: bolt, gear, valve. He showed the boy how to listen. For the moment, a machine tells you what it wants. He taught the young woman how to set a plow so the field reads like a book instead of a wound. At night, he wrote letters home and folded them carefully so the paper made a clean sound. When he left, there were no goodbyes, only next time. He carried back with him a small tin of Texas soil wrapped in wax paper, a ridiculous, holy thing. He sprinkled a pinch by the schoolhouse door, where his mother kept geraniums in chipped mugs. The flowers did not care which continent fed them. They only cared for light and water and hands. Years stacked themselves. And the story of the POWs, who had picked peaches and mended fences for men with their own names, became a tale people told when they wanted to believe in countries that speak to each other kindly. Men who had been guards sent Christmas cards. Men who had been prisoners sent photographs of babies in woolen caps. The mail crossed the ocean as if the water were a field and the letters were seeds. Karl married the farmer's daughter in Lower Saxony in a church with a clean bell. Heinrich sent a telegram that read like a hymn: "Work hard, love gently, eat dessert." Mrs. Müller sent a quilt sewn from shirts that had grown old in honorable work. When a son was born, they named him Heinrich, because names also make bridges. On a quiet evening many years later, Karl walked with his boy along the river and told the story the way fathers do, skipping the parts that do not fit in small ears and then, later, adding them back in careful handfuls. He told him about cotton and porches, about a word written inside a Bible and a fence line that held. He told him the truth men seldom say plainly, that enemies become neighbors when they share a harvest, and neighbors become family when they share a table. He kept the Bible by the door, where keys and promises live. Its corners were rounded now, and the inscription had faded into the paper, the way light fades into evening. When he picked it up, his hands remembered a porch rail warm from sun, and the weight of a welcome that had crossed an ocean. Germany did not become perfect. Neither did America. But the line between them learned how to turn into a road when people walked it often enough. In towns on both sides of the water, there were barns with names that people could pronounce in two ways, and kitchens where grace could be said in either language without anyone noticing which had been chosen that day. Sometimes, near harvest, Karl would lift his son onto the tractor and let him steer down a road that looked straight enough to carry a prayer. The boy would ask the same question every time: "Papa, why did they help you?" And Karl would answer the same way every time: "Because some truths need repetition to become part of a family. Because they remembered who they were before the war told them otherwise." On the anniversary of the day the trucks had carried them out through Texas fields, he wrote one more letter. Not long, not grand. He told the Millers the wheat stood high that year, and the river had been generous. He enclosed a photograph of a boy on a tractor, a quilt in the background, a woman laughing with her hair caught by wind. He wrote one sentence that had waited too many seasons for its chance: "We are your guests still, even when we are far." The reply came with a picture of a new porch and an old oak and a mailbox that had never changed its mind. The note was signed by hands that had grown older wisely. "The guest room is ready. The dawn still keeps its appointment. Come when the harvest rests." He put the letter back in the Bible and closed it gently, the way you close a door on a room that holds both past and future. Then he went outside, where the evening had already set the field glowing. and he walked the fence line that had taught him what holds the world together, not barbed wire, but work done side by side. Not speeches, but names on mailboxes that admit the world is wide and also very small. When the wind came up, it carried the smell of cut wheat, and underneath it, if a man had the right history in his nose, a phantom of cotton and hot dust, from a summer when enemies taught each other how to be neighbors, and neighbors remembered how to be human.